Tashdilek and welcome to In Conversation with Tibet TV. In this episode, we have the Executive Director of Canada Tibet Committee, Mr. Sherap Therchin. Mr. Sherap is the former Deputy Director of the Himalayan Society for Youth and Women Empowerment, Nepal, and the Deputy Chief of Tibet Fund Office in India. He is one of the most vocal and active Tibetan youth leader in Canada with his expertise in advocacy and communication. Tashdilek and welcome to our program.
Thank you.
Okay, so Sherapla, North America has one of the largest Tibetan diaspora community outside of India, especially in Canada. And every year, the Tibetan community there and your organization, Canada Tibet Committee, organizes Tibet Lobby Day, where you reach out to the local government officials, members of the Canadian Parliament, to engage them in a dialogue or a conversation about Tibet and garner support for Tibet. And also, you are one of the witnesses at the hearing, which is organized by the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on International Human Rights hearing on Tibet this year, right? Which is May this year. So, and where as a witness, you talk about the Chinese government's practices of residential boarding school in Tibet. So, I'd like to ask, what are the developments and receptions, positive reception actually, from these lobbies and hearings in Canada for Tibet cause?
Sure. Thank you, Vandana. So, yes, we had Canada Tibet Lobby Day this year with the participation of over 30 to 35 delegates, mainly from within Ontario, from Toronto and Ottawa, and a couple of individuals from Montreal as well. And we met, I think, over 10 different members of parliament from all political parties. And the key ask for the Tibet Lobby Day this year was the request for the appointment of contact person for Tibet issues within the Canadian government, specifically at the Global Affairs Canada. Along with the key ask of appointment of the liaison or the contact at the Tibet specific officer, we also had asked to follow up actions on the parliamentary support for the Sino-Tibetan dialogue. And as you mentioned earlier, we had testimony on the parliamentary study on the residential school system in Tibet. And I had a chance to join individuals from Tibet Action Institute, Tendola, including Sijabrambuchi from the monastery, the representative Tashilumbo Monastery. So we talked about issues concerning the residential school system, and this was very important in context to Canada because of Canada's history in the treatment of its indigenous people. I had a chance to talk about how Canada could take this more seriously, what Canada can do it at the international level, what Canada can do at the national level, and as you know, the Parliament came up with a report including 18 different recommendations, including recommendations on the support for the investigation on the residential school system at the different platforms, including at the UN platform. The recommendation also included the investigation on whereabouts of Panchen Lama, and also included a recommendation to support education system for Tibetan school and financial support to the Central Tibetan Administration. So, within all this, whether it's the parliamentary hearings, whether it is us meeting, MPs as part of the annual Tibet Lobby Days, we try to bring our concerns about the issues that are very urgent, whether it is, the treatment of young Tibetan children in Tibet, whether it is the geopolitical, situation concerning Canada and China, and including, foreign interference that is very current in Canada. That's a discussion that's been going on for many months.
You mean the Chinese government involvement in Canada
Yes.
election, right? Where
Yes.
I think you appeared on that. You have given an interview
Yes.
on that.
Yes.
Okay, so coming to China, in this current global political scenario, where many countries, mostly developed countries, on the one hand, they are heavily dependent on the Chinese economic benefits, and also with their economic ties, trade ties with China, and at the same time, they are also very angered by China's expansionist move and its role in the COVID-19 pandemic. Which somewhat China is responsible for that. So in these circumstances, what opportunities and scope do you see for advocacy and outreach for Tibet in the governments and international bodies, and how do you take these opportunities?
Yes. I think a lot of what we do is partly contributed by our own efforts, interests and initiative, including the hearings and meetings, but and some part of it happens also because of the situation that affects Canada's relationship with China. So I think I joined Canada Tibet in 2018, but I noticed that the opportunity for Tibet advocacy changed, and not just Tibet advocacy concerning anything that is related to China, whether it is Uyghur Hong Kong advocacy. So that the window of opportunity for advocacy increased, especially after December 2018. So what happened in December 2018 is, of course, the arrest of Man Wanzhou by Canadian government at the request of the United States. And what followed after that was the China's detention of two Canadian, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. And that really, I think, sparked public outrage towards Chinese government aggression, Canadian people in aggression. Before that, I would say Canada and Canadian people perception towards China was relatively, compared to U.S., it was relatively friendly. But a lot of things happened during this time period, right? Whether it is perception over, disinformation that's going on around COVID, or whether it is really Xi Jinping, aggression, whether it's the fact is that China changed from one-party state to one-person regime, and during this transition, what we see is that the peaceful rise of China that happened for many decades has suddenly derailed, and that derailed, I think, kind of provoked more insecurity, more reaction from the Chinese government towards its neighbor and also towards the Western countries. And in response, I think the democratic countries in the West, as well as in Asia, including countries like Japan, South Korea, and India, have taken China as a threat rather than a peaceful rising economy. And that has opened really a window of opportunity for human rights activists like us to promote Tibet issues at more higher level.
Indeed, when we talk about the developed countries and countries like Canada and US, most of these countries were one of the strongest supporter of Tibet when it comes to human rights violation in Tibet, is it? And they often speak about that, whether it be the members of the parliament or the heads of the government, not necessarily, but the members of the parliament.
Yes, I mean, I think as Dr. Michael Wenwell said in his presentation at the International Youth Forum, the international community, including the Western democracy, has spoken on human rights issues for a long time. But we really expect and we hope and we demand that the international community speak beyond the human rights issues. The human rights issues doesn't necessarily have to do with Tibet. It is part of a Western values system that they speak on human rights, and we appreciate that. But we want them to speak on political issues as well, because Tibet issue is more than just the human rights issues. We want them to speak on the Tibet as a unresolved conflict, international conflict, and this is what I think is a challenge for us to really push the international government, including Canadian government.
So there is a need of stronger political push or the support from the governments, which is what Dr. Michael Wentwald, in his book, he talks about. As a Tibetan, we have a lot of support from outside countries in terms of when they talk about religion and other stuff, as a human level. But there's not much discussion when it comes to political aspects. So, which is what you are saying.
Yes.
Okay. So my next question is: there is a considerable number of Tibetan population in North America, and there are a lot of young Tibetans who are brought up in that environment where they do not have that much of a constant touch with the traditions of Tibet. But on the positive side, there is this young generation of Tibetans in the West who have, unlike born in other countries, they have more legal rights and opportunities available to them to make differences in their policy-making processes in their respective countries, right? So what are the best way to engage the younger generation of Tibetans who resides in the West in the movement for Tibetan freedom struggle?
Yes. I had a chance to talk about this in my presentation yesterday at the Youth Forum. I think the general environment for Tibet advocacy by anyone, including by Tibetan youth, is the environment as of now. The current environment is very suitable, very receptive in our favor, for several reasons. Externally, as I mentioned earlier, the geopolitical situation concerning China has changed. The Western countries, the democratic countries, have started taking China as a threat for what it is. And internally, we have, I've been noticing that the rise of young Tibetan talent. So, somewhere between the intersection of the external change and internal change, I think there's an immense opportunity for really to push, to strengthen Tibet advocacy at the higher level. And this is where I think this guidance and leadership of Central Tibetan Administration is very, very much needed, and also very, I think, timely. Yes, there are a lot of young Tibetans growing up now in the past few years in the West, and there's a skill, there's a knowledge, there's talent, but there's also passion and interest among them. And we need to find a way to connect this passion and skill together to bring them be part of the advocacy. I sense that every Tibetan is really interested and they want to do something for the cause. But sometimes it helps to provide them with the guidance and provide them with the navigation on which direction they should go. And once we provide that initial guidance, I think youth have that knowledge to find ways so that they can contribute on their own. I think this is very essential, and I think we are heading in the right direction with the rise of young Tibetan talent, with general environment for Tibet advocacy being in the favor of Tibet and human rights issues in general. So the timing is perfect, I think.
Okay, and between CTA, Central Tibetan Administration, and Tibetans in the West, especially the younger generations, what strategies can you think of to work together in the same wavelength of ideas and goal for the cause of Tibet?
I think the Tibet issue, as we know, is very multifaceted. Right? It's very complex. As I mentioned earlier, it is part of it is human rights issues, part of it is political issues, part of it is also environmental issues. And again, I'm quoting Michael Wentwald today. He said that Xi Jinping has, instead of giving more autonomy, he's taking whatever little autonomy we have in Tibet, he's taking away that. So we have been hoping that we would get more genuine autonomy. But what's really happening in reality is that the Chinese government under Xi Jinping is taking, every moment, every opportunity he gets, and not just Tibet, from East Turkestan, the Uyghur region, from the Inner Mongolia, from the other parts of China, the autonomy, the freedom is decreasing. And that presents, urgency for young for Tibetans in general to do more. And the resources they need, I think this is where CTA can really help. The reason I mentioned the complexity and the multifaceted of Tibetan issue is because you want to talk about Tibet issue, but what do you want to focus on? And this is where CTA, including the Tibet Policy Institute, if they can provide guidance, perhaps with access to resources, a briefing points for young Tibetan talents to, speak to the Canadian, not just Canadian, sorry, international community, right? Member of Parliament, the government officials, and also more importantly, media, to the international media, what issue they want to talk about, and CTA could provide that resources. Once you have that resources, the interest, the skills, the communication, they have the talent to articulate all these issues. But we want to help them as a member of Tibet support group. We are there to support. But more importantly, CTA has shown interest to support them with the providing resources in terms of connecting with the current issues of Tibet.
So Sherap, these are my questions for today, and it was wonderful talking to you. And
thank you, Alhamdulillah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Pleasure having you.
And I wish you all the best for your all the work of Tibet Advocacy in Canada, and more power to you.
Thank you. Keep up the good work. Thank you.
With this, we have come to the end of today's In Conversation with Tibet TV. See you all in the next episode.